"You're not going to believe this," Silvia said, her voice a mix of excitement and nerves as she sat across from her best friend Emma. Her eyes sparkled with secrets, and her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her blouse. "What's going on?" Emma leaned in, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Silvia took a deep breath, her heart racing. "I've been seeing someone." She paused, watching Emma's reaction closely. Her friend's eyes widened, but she remained silent, giving Silvia the space to continue. "It's been going on for a while now, and I think I'm in love with him." Emma leaned back in her chair, surprise etched on her features. "Who is he?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Silvia's secret had always been a fortress, and Emma knew better than to rush her. Silvia looked down at her trembling hands before meeting her friend's gaze. "His name is Richard," she said softly. "He's a consultant at work. We've been working on the same project for the past few months." Emma's expression remained neutral, but her thoughts raced. She had noticed the change in Silvia lately, the secret smiles, the extra sparkle in her eyes, the sudden urgency to leave work early. Now it all made sense. "How did it start?" she asked, genuinely curious but careful not to sound judgmental. Silvia's cheeks flushed, and she looked away. "It just happened," she murmured, playing with her wedding band. "We had so much in common, and the way he made me feel." She trailed off, lost in the memory of it all. "It was like I was seeing myself in a new light, like I could be anyone I wanted to be with him." Emma nodded, listening intently. She knew the feeling all too well, having once been swept off her feet by a coworker's charm herself. But she also knew the potential consequences of such a situation, especially for a married woman with a young daughter. Rachel, only 5 years old, was the innocent bystander in Silvia's tumultuous love affair. Silvia's husband, Andy, was a devoted father and a hardworking man. His dedication to his family was unwavering, and he had no clue about the storm brewing beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect marriage. At 37, he had built a life around Silvia and Rachel, giving them everything they needed and more. His trust in Silvia was absolute, and the thought of her betrayal would surely shatter the foundation of his world. Andy was a man of routine, his day beginning with the aroma of fresh coffee wafting through the house as he prepared for work. Rachel's laughter echoed in the background as she played with her toys, while Silvia got ready for her own day at the office. He kissed them both goodbye, feeling content with the life they had created together. But as the days went by, Andy started noticing subtle changes in Silvia. She was more distant, often lost in thought, and her usual warmth had been replaced by a cool detachment. Richard, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of passion and excitement. At 35, he had a way of making Silvia feel alive again, like she was rediscovering the woman she once was before the responsibilities of marriage and motherhood had settled upon her. His eyes held a mischievous glint that spoke of adventures unexplored, and his touch was like a jolt of electricity, sending waves of pleasure and guilt through her body. Their stolen moments together were intoxicating, a dangerous dance that Silvia found increasingly hard to resist. As the affair grew more intense, so did the risks. Whispered phone calls turned into secret lunches, which evolved into clandestine meetings in hotel rooms. Silvia's once meticulously organized life was now a tangled web of lies and deceit, with Rachel's tiny figure in the center, blissfully unaware of the chaos her mother was weaving around them. The guilt gnawed at Silvia's conscience, but the pull of Richard's embrace was stronger than any moral compass. One evening, as Rachel played in her room, Silvia sat at the kitchen table, staring at divorce papers she had printed out. Andy was due home soon, and she knew she had to tell him. Her hand hovered over the pen, trembling. Could she really do this to him? To Rachel? Yet, she felt an overwhelming desire for a life with Richard, free from the shackles of her current existence. The front door opened, and the sound of Andy's footsteps grew louder. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation she had been avoiding. He walked in, tie loosened and face weary from a long day's work. He kissed Rachel's forehead as she ran to greet him, then looked at Silvia with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She knew he had noticed the distance between them, but he had attributed it to stress or perhaps a temporary phase. Silvia's hand closed around the cool metal of the pen. "Andy," she began, her voice quivering slightly, "we need to talk." She watched as he set Rachel down and took a seat across from her, his gaze a mix of curiosity and concern. "I don't think I can do this anymore," she said, the words coming out in a rush. She didn't mention Richard, she couldn't. Instead, she spoke of feeling stifled, of needing to find herself again. Andy's eyes searched hers, looking for the truth she was withholding. He leaned back, the shock slowly setting in. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. Rachel's giggles from the next room seemed to mock the gravity of the moment. Silvia took a deep breath and slid the divorce papers across the table. "I've been unhappy for a while now," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "I think it's best if we go our separate ways." Andy stared at the papers, his mind racing. "Is there someone else?" he asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. Silvia looked up, her eyes pleading. "No," she replied, her voice shaky. "It's just me. I've changed, and I don't think I can be the wife you deserve anymore." The lie felt like a knife twisting in her gut, but she couldn't bring herself to reveal the truth about Richard. The silence stretched between them, filled only with Rachel's distant laughter. Finally, Andy spoke, his voice low and measured. "I don't understand," he said, his eyes searching hers. "We can work through this. We can go to counseling, take a vacation, anything. Just tell me what you need." Silvia's heart broke a little more with each plea. She had never seen Andy so vulnerable, so willing to fight for their marriage. But the die had been cast, and she couldn't bring herself to take it back. "I've already made up my mind," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry." Andy's gaze fell to the table, his eyes glazed over. Rachel's laughter grew quieter as he processed the information, the realization sinking in that their life as they knew it was about to change forever. Without another word, he stood and left the room, the weight of Silvia's decision hanging heavily on his shoulders. Rachel wandered in, her smile fading as she sensed the tension. "Daddy," she called out, but he didn't respond. The following weeks were a blur of tears and legal jargon. The house that had once been filled with warmth and laughter now echoed with the hollow sounds of a family falling apart. Silvia moved out, leaving behind a trail of pain and confusion that Rachel tried to navigate with the help of her favorite teddy bear. Andy, torn between anger and grief, threw himself into his work, seeking solace in the familiar patterns of his job. Surprisingly, the divorce was more amicable than Silvia had anticipated. Andy's love for Rachel and his desire to minimize the damage to her young life allowed him to set aside his heartache and negotiate fairly. He agreed to joint custody, ensuring Rachel had a stable routine with both parents, despite the tumultuous circumstances. His heart broke each time he saw Rachel's puzzled expression when she asked for her mom, but he knew that it was the right choice for her. Silvia moved into a sleek apartment near her office, the stark contrast to her former home a constant reminder of the path she had chosen. The walls were white and bare, echoing the emptiness she felt inside. Rachel's toys remained neatly packed away in her old room, their absence a painful reminder of what she had left behind. Meanwhile, Richard had also moved to the same apartment complex, his own place just a few floors above hers. Their proximity was both thrilling and terrifying. Every time she saw him, Silvia felt a rush of excitement followed by a wave of guilt that threatened to drown her. Andy had taken the news of the divorce with a stoic grace that Silvia hadn't expected. His focus shifted to Rachel, making sure she felt loved and secure amidst the turmoil. He picked her up from school and took her to soccer practice, his face a mask of determination to keep their routine as normal as possible. Silvia watched from a distance, her heart wrenching as Rachel called out for her mother with a confused look, not quite understanding why she wasn't there. The days of joint custody began with a stiff exchange of pleasantries as Silvia picked Rachel up for her weekends. Rachel would cling to Andy, her tiny fingers gripping his shirt, not wanting to leave the familiar comfort of her dad's arms. Silvia felt like an intruder in her own life, her heart heavy with the knowledge that Rachel was the one paying the highest price for her choices. Yet, Rachel, with the resilience of a child, soon adapted to the new routine, her innocence shielding her from the complexities of adult pain. When Rachel was with her, Silvia tried to keep her world as stable as possible. They baked cookies, watched movies, and painted their nails together, trying to recreate the warmth of the home they had once shared. But Rachel's questions about her daddy and their old house gnawed at Silvia's conscience, each inquiry a reminder of the fissure she had created in her daughter's life. Richard would visit during these weekends, his presence a stark contrast to the warmth Rachel brought into the apartment. He was more intense than ever, his eyes burning with a passion that seemed to consume them both. The moments of joy with Rachel were shadowed by the passionate whispers and stolen kisses with Richard. Silvia felt torn between her love for her daughter and her desire for the man who had shaken her world. His touch was like a drug, and she craved the high it brought her. But every time Rachel looked at her with those wide, innocent eyes, she was jolted back to reality, the guilt of her choices stinging like a fresh wound. One fateful afternoon, Andy arrived to pick Rachel up after their weekend together. Silvia had just stepped out to grab some groceries, leaving Rachel with Richard. The door swung open, and Rachel's squeal of delight filled the room as she threw herself into her father's arms. But the joyful reunion was shattered when Andy's gaze fell upon Richard, lounging on the couch. The air grew thick with tension, and Rachel's giggles ceased abruptly, her eyes darting between the two men. Silvia rushed in, her heart racing at the sight of her worlds colliding. She had hoped to avoid this moment, to keep the sanctity of Rachel's time with Andy separate from her new life with Richard. But fate had other plans. Richard, caught off guard, awkwardly stood up, a look of surprise etched on his face. Andy's eyes narrowed, and the muscles in his jaw tightened. The anger in his eyes was palpable, a silent storm brewing. Without a word, Andy scooped Rachel into his arms, her little body stiffening at the sudden tension. Rachel looked up at her father, her eyes wide with fear, and Silvia felt a fresh stab of guilt. "Daddy?" Rachel's voice was trembling, and Andy's gaze never left Richard. He didn't answer, his eyes speaking volumes of pain and betrayal. Silvia's hand reached out to her daughter, but Rachel clung to her father, burying her face in his shoulder. Silvia watched as Andy turned and walked out, Rachel's tiny hand clutching his shirt tightly. She heard Rachel's muffled sobs as the door clicked shut, leaving her alone with Richard and the echoes of their shattered lives. "What have I done?" she whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion. Richard looked at her, his expression unreadable. That night, her phone buzzed with a message from Andy, "We need to talk. Meet me at the park tomorrow, 2 p.m. The words were cold, the lack of emotion in his text stark and final. Silvia's heart raced as she reread the message, her mind reeling with dread. What could he possibly want to say to her now? The next afternoon, Silvia found Andy at the park, Rachel's favorite swing swaying gently in the breeze. His eyes were dark with anger, his jaw set in a firm line. Rachel, oblivious to the tension, played in the sandbox nearby, her giggles piercing the silence. Silvia approached, her heart in her throat. "How could you do this?" Andy's voice was low, his anger barely restrained. "I thought we agreed to keep our personal lives separate from Rachel. I never wanted her to know about." His voice trailed off, unable to voice the betrayal. Silvia felt her stomach drop. "I know, I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes never leaving Rachel. "It was a mistake. I didn't plan for it to happen like that." "A mistake?" Andy's voice grew louder, his eyes flashing. "You didn't plan on hiding it from me? Or you didn't plan on her seeing it?" He gestured angrily towards Rachel. "I don't give a fuck who you spread your legs for, Silvia, but not in front of our daughter." Silvia flinched at the harshness of his words, feeling the sting of truth in his anger. Rachel looked up, her laughter dying as she sensed the tension between her parents. Daddy, she called out, her voice quivering. Andy took a deep breath and forced a smile, turning to reassure her before she could approach. It's okay, Ratch, go play. Rachel's eyes searched her mother's face, looking for the same comfort she found in her father's voice. Silvia's heart shattered into a million pieces. In the 10 years she had known Andy, Silvia had never seen him this furious. His calm demeanor had always been a rock she could lean on, even when the storms of life raged around them. But now, the veil of his patience had been torn away, revealing the depth of his pain. His use of a curse word, so rare in their relationship, hit her like a sledgehammer. It was a stark reminder of the gravity of her actions. I'm sorry, Silvia said again, her voice small and trembling. I never meant for it to get this out of hand. She took a step closer, but Andy held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. The space between them felt like a chasm she had created, one she wasn't sure she could ever bridge. With a heavy heart, Andy turned away, his gaze falling on Rachel as she played. This is about Rachel now, he said, his voice tight with emotion. I want you to promise me she won't be caught in the crossfire anymore. Silvia nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I promise, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She knew she had crossed a line, and the sight of Rachel, blissfully playing, was a stark reminder of the innocence she had endangered. Andy didn't respond, his eyes never leaving Rachel. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he turned and walked away, his shoulders tense and his back straight. Rachel called out for her mother, but Silvia couldn't move. She watched as her husband and daughter disappeared from view, their figures becoming smaller and smaller until they were swallowed by the horizon. Back at her office, Silvia felt the weight of Andy's words pressing down on her. She sat at her desk, her eyes unfocused on the spreadsheet in front of her. The office buzzed with the usual sounds of phones ringing and colleagues chattering, but it all felt so distant. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Rachel's trembling voice and the fear in her eyes. It was a stark contrast to the passionate whispers she shared with Richard in the privacy of her apartment. That evening, she sat across from Richard in a dimly lit restaurant, the scent of garlic and wine heavy in the air. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her mind racing with the implications of their relationship. She took a deep breath and met his gaze. We need to talk, she said, her voice firm despite the tremble in her chest. Richard's expression grew serious, his eyes searching hers. What's wrong? He asked, his thumb tracing absent patterns on the white tablecloth. Silvia took a deep breath and leaned in. I can't see you this weekend, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. It's Rachel's time with me, and I need to focus on her. Richard's smile faded, and his grip on the wine glass tightened. What do you mean? Silvia looked down at her plate, pushing the food around with her fork. I mean, she began, her voice wavering, that Rachel is my priority right now. After what happened last weekend, I can't have her involved in any more of this mess. Richard leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched. So, you're just going to ignore me when you have Rachel? His tone was sharp, his eyes cold. Silvia swallowed hard, feeling the heat of his gaze. It's not about ignoring you, she said, her voice a whisper. It's about protecting her. Richard's eyes narrowed, a hint of anger flaring in his gaze. So, what? I'm not good enough to be around Rachel? Silvia's eyes snapped up to meet his, a flash of irritation crossing her face. It's not about you being good enough, Richard. It's about what's best for her, she said firmly. Andy is her father. He deserves to have time with her without any complications. So, I'm just a complication now? Richard's voice was tight with emotion. He took a gulp of wine, his eyes never leaving hers. Is that what I've become? Silvia's heart squeezed. She knew she was hurting him, but she couldn't ignore the guilt that had been gnawing at her since Rachel had witnessed their tense encounter. It's not like that, she said, reaching for his hand. But we can't keep doing this. It's not fair to her. Richard pulled his hand away, his eyes searching hers. What are you saying, Silvia? His voice was low, laced with a mix of anger and hurt. You're choosing him over me? After everything we've shared? Silvia's chest tightened, and she took a sip of her wine, trying to gather her thoughts. I'm not choosing anyone, she replied, her voice steady. But Rachel comes first. I left Andy for us, Richard. For the life we could have together. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. But what kind of life is it if we can't even be together when Rachel is around? Silvia felt a tear slip down her cheek. It's just until Rachel understands, she said, her voice shaking. I can't take that away Andy from her life. He is her father and Rachel loves him so much. Richard's gaze softened slightly, but the tension remained. I know, he said, his voice tight. But what about us? Silvia took a deep breath, her eyes searching for the right words. I love you, she said finally, her voice a whisper. But for now, Rachel needs to come first. I don't want her to feel confused or hurt by this. Richard sat back, his eyes clouded with a mix of understanding and disappointment. He reached for his wine glass, his hand shaking slightly. I get it, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. But it's not going to be easy for me. Silvia's heart ached as she watched him struggle to process her words. She knew he was hurt, but she also knew that Rachel's well-being had to be the priority. She reached out, placing her hand over his. I know, she said gently. But I believe in us. We'll find a way to make this work. With a heavy heart, she left the restaurant and drove back to her apartment. The once exciting space now felt cold and empty without Rachel's laughter filling the air. She walked through the quiet hallways, the echo of her heels a stark reminder of the solitary life she had chosen. The walls seemed to close in on her, whispering accusations of her selfishness and deceit. Inside, the silence was deafening. Rachel's toys lay scattered, a reminder of the joy and chaos her daughter brought to the otherwise sterile space. Silvia picked up a tiny, forgotten shoe and held it to her chest, the scent of her little girl's feet bringing a fresh wave of tears. She missed Rachel with a fierce ache, one that she knew could never be filled by the fleeting comfort of Richard's arms. Her eyes fell on a framed photo on the side table, a happy family portrait from a summer vacation. Rachel's laughter was captured mid-giggle, her tiny hand reaching for Andy's, who was beaming down at her. Silvia's own smile was radiant, the love in her eyes for her husband and daughter unmistakable. As she stared at the image, doubt began to gnaw at her. Had she made the right choice? Was Richard's love worth the cost of her family's happiness? A month had passed since she had moved out, and her relationship with Richard had grown closer, fueled by passionate whispers and stolen moments of intimacy. Yet, the void left by Andy's absence was as vast as the ocean, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't fill it. Rachel's weekends with her were a bittersweet mix of joy and sorrow. Her daughter's laughter echoed through the apartment, but the silence that followed her departure was deafening. The inevitable day came when she had to face Andy again. The sight of him waiting outside Rachel's kindergarten, his eyes scanning the playground, brought a fresh wave of guilt. She watched as Rachel ran towards him, her pigtails bobbing up and down, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Andy's eyes lit up at the sight of their daughter, but as they fell on Silvia, she saw something she had never seen before: disgust. It was a look that chilled her to the bone, a silent condemnation that spoke louder than any words. The conversation between them was strained, their voices clipped and formal as they discussed Rachel's needs. Her teacher says she's been acting out, Andy said, his voice devoid of any warmth. She misses you. Silvia's heart twisted at the accusation, but she knew he wasn't wrong. Rachel had been clingier than usual, her questions about the new living arrangement tinged with confusion and sadness. Silvia nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. I'll talk to her, she promised, her voice barely above a whisper. Make sure she knows she's loved. Andy nodded curtly, his eyes never leaving Rachel. That's all that matters now, he said, his voice clipped. As Rachel climbed into her car seat, Silvia watched her go with a heavy heart. The distance between them was palpable, a stark contrast to the easy affection they had once shared. The car pulled away, and Silvia felt a piece of herself drive away with it. She turned to walk back to her own car, her steps leaden with the weight of her choices. That night, as she lay in bed alone, the silence was a deafening reminder of the life she had left behind. Rachel's laughter and Andy's gentle snores had been replaced by the mechanical hum of the city outside. She picked up her phone and dialed Andy's number, her hand trembling. He answered on the first ring, his voice tinged with weariness. "Is everything okay?" he asked, the concern evident despite his guarded tone. Silvia took a deep breath. "I just wanted to check on Rachel," she said, her voice small. "How is she?" Andy sighed heavily. "She's okay," he replied, the exhaustion evident in his voice. "But she misses you." Silvia felt a pang of pain at his words, the guilt of her actions weighing heavily on her. "I miss her too," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." There was a brief silence on the line, and she could almost hear Andy's thoughts racing. "How are you?" she asked tentatively, hoping to bridge the gap that had grown between them. "I'm managing," Andy replied, his voice tight with restrained emotion. "But let's not talk about me, just focus on Rachel." Silvia felt the tears prick her eyes, the indifference in his voice cutting deeper than any blade. She had hoped for a sign of the warmth they had once shared, but it was clear that the chasm between them had grown too wide. "Okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What can I do to help?" Andy's response was curt. "Just be there for her," he said. "That's all I ask." The line went dead, and Silvia was left with the echo of his final words. She stared at her phone, feeling a tear slip down her cheek. It was the first time Andy had spoken to her without any warmth, without any of the love that had once been the foundation of their relationship. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She had lost him. In the quiet of her apartment, Silvia allowed herself to feel the full weight of her decision. She had chosen Richard, thinking his love and excitement would be enough to fill the void in her soul. But now, with Rachel's confusion and Andy's coldness, she realized that what she had with Richard paled in comparison to the deep bond she had with her husband. The passion was new and thrilling, but the love she shared with Andy was a warm embrace she had taken for granted. The following week, Andy called Silvia with a proposal she never expected. His voice was measured, devoid of any hint of anger or resentment. "I've been thinking," he began, "and I think it's time Rachel starts spending time with Richard. He's a part of your life now, and she deserves to know him." Silvia's heart skipped a beat. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice tentative. "Yes," Andy replied, his voice firm. "It's the right thing to do." Silvia felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, she was relieved that Andy was being so mature about the situation, but on the other, she was devastated that he had so clearly accepted her decision to leave him for Richard. In his willingness to include Rachel's father in her life, she could hear the final nail being hammered into the coffin of their marriage. The weekend arrived, and with it, a sense of dread. Richard was eager to meet Rachel, his eyes alight with excitement as they waited in the park for Andy to drop her off. Silvia's heart was a tumultuous mess, her love for her daughter warring with the guilt of what she had done to her family. Rachel looked up at Richard, her curiosity piqued by the unfamiliar man who held her mother's hand so tightly. As Rachel climbed off the swing and approached them, her eyes wide with curiosity, Silvia felt the void in her heart expand, swallowing up any joy she might have felt in this moment. Richard bent down, a gentle smile on his face, and offered Rachel a tentative hello. Rachel looked to Silvia for guidance, and Silvia could only manage a weak smile, her heart feeling heavier than ever before. "Rachel," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "this is Richard. He's a friend of mine." Rachel studied the unfamiliar man, her little hand tightening around Silvia's. "But where's Daddy?" she asked, her voice tinged with a hint of sadness that Silvia recognized all too well. Silvia's heart ached, but she forced a smile. Daddy had to work this weekend, she said, her eyes flicking briefly to Richard. He met her gaze with a smug smirk that made her stomach turn. It was a look that said he knew the truth, that he had one. As Rachel's eyes searched hers for the truth, Silvia felt a twinge of regret. She had wanted Rachel to meet Richard without any preconceived notions, but she couldn't help feeling that her daughter was being thrust into a world of lies and deceit. Rachel looked from Silvia to Richard and then back again, her confusion clear. "It's okay, Rach," Silvia said softly, trying to reassure her. "Daddy knows about Richard, and he wants you to be happy." Rachel's eyes widened, and she looked at Richard with newfound interest. He knelt down, his smirk replaced with a forced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hi, Rachel," he said, his voice smooth. "I've heard so much about you." Rachel took a step back, her grip on Silvia's hand tightening. "You know Daddy?" she asked, her voice small. Silvia nodded, her heart breaking at Rachel's innocence. "Yes," she said, her voice catching. "Daddy and I are friends with Richard now." Rachel's brow furrowed, and she looked up at Silvia for confirmation. Silvia forced a smile, her stomach in knots. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered. "We're all friends." As Rachel tentatively reached out to Richard, Silvia watched the interaction with a heavy heart. The sadness in Rachel's eyes as she looked at the man who was supposed to be her new family was like a knife twisting in Silvia's soul. Rachel's smile never quite reached her eyes, and her laughter sounded forced, a stark contrast to the genuine giggles she had shared with Andy just moments earlier. Richard's attempts to engage Rachel were met with polite nods and half-hearted smiles, a stark reminder of the happiness that had once filled their weekends. One day, as Silvia was preparing for work, her phone buzzed with a text from Andy. Rachel's birthday was approaching, and she could almost feel the hope in his words as he asked if they could all go to the theme park together. It was Rachel's wish, he said, to spend the day with both her mommy and daddy, just like old times. Silvia's heart swelled with love and guilt in equal measure as she read the message. She had never wanted to cause Rachel any pain, but her selfish actions had led them to this point. The morning of Rachel's birthday, Silvia's apartment was a flurry of activity. Rachel's laughter filled the hallways as she chased the balloons Silvia had blown up the night before. The sight of Andy at the door, a gentle smile on his face, brought a mix of nostalgia and regret to Silvia's heart. He held a small gift bag, the corners of his eyes crinkling with the same warmth he had always had for Rachel. "Ready to go?" he asked, his eyes meeting Silvia's briefly before flicking back to their daughter. Rachel squealed with excitement, grabbing Silvia's hand and pulling her towards the door. The theme park was a cacophony of laughter and screams as families darted from ride to ride. Rachel's eyes sparkled as she looked from Silvia to Andy, her excitement palpable. They held hands, forming a little family unit again, as they walked through the gates. For a brief moment, Silvia allowed herself to feel the happiness that once came so naturally to them. The smell of cotton candy and the distant sound of carousel music filled the air, and Rachel's chatter was a sweet reminder of what they had lost. As they approached the roller coaster, Rachel's eyes grew wide with excitement. "Mommy, can we go on the big one?" she asked, tugging on Silvia's hand. Silvia looked to Andy, who nodded, his smile genuine for the first time in months. The thrill of the ride washed over Rachel as they ascended, her giggles mixing with the rushing wind. Andy's laughter was a warm embrace, and Silvia felt a pang of regret for the moments she had missed. Just as they were about to disembark, Silvia's heart skipped a beat. Richard was standing in the crowd, his eyes locked on them with a possessive gaze. Rachel didn't notice him at first, lost in the excitement of the day. But as they stepped off the ride, Rachel's eyes lit up with recognition. "Mommy, there's Richard," she exclaimed, running towards him. Silvia's stomach twisted into a knot as Richard approached, a wide smile plastered on his face. Andy stiffened beside her, his jaw clenched. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Rachel threw her arms around Richard's legs, looking up at him with pure adoration. Surprise, Ratch, he said, his voice too cheerful. Silvia watched as Andy's smile tightened, the effort to hide his anger visible in every line of his face. Hi, Richard, Andy said through gritted teeth, his hand outstretched in a forced gesture of camaraderie. Richard took it, his grip firm and smug. Silvia could see the unspoken challenge in his eyes, daring Andy to make a scene. Rachel looked from her mother to her father and back again, her own smile wavering as she sensed the tension. I didn't know you were coming, Silvia said, her voice tight. Richard shrugged. Couldn't miss Rachel's birthday, he replied, his eyes never leaving Andy's. Silvia felt a wave of anger wash over her. He had no right to be here, inserting himself into their family day. Rachel was looking from one to the other, her excitement waning as the atmosphere grew tense. Andy stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. It's okay, he said to Rachel. Why don't we go get some ice cream? Rachel looked up at Silvia, her eyes wide and questioning. Silvia nodded, swallowing her pride. Sounds like a good idea, she said, forcing a smile. As they turned to walk away, Richard's hand shot out, gripping Silvia's arm. Let go, she hissed, pulling away from him. His grip tightened, his eyes flashing with anger. You can't just ignore me, he whispered, his voice low enough that Rachel couldn't hear. I'm part of your life now. Silvia's eyes narrowed, her voice steady. Not here, she said firmly. Not today. Rachel's eyes darted between them, the excitement of the theme park forgotten as she sensed the discord. Silvia took Rachel's hand again, tugging her away from Richard. Come on, sweetie, she said, her voice strained. Let's go get that ice cream. Rachel looked back at Richard, her smile fading as she tried to understand the tension between the adults. The walk to the ice cream stand was fraught with unspoken accusations and recriminations. Andy's jaw was set, his eyes focused straight ahead. Rachel skipped slightly, trying to maintain the facade of happiness, but the energy between her parents was unmistakable. Silvia felt torn, her heart aching for Rachel's confusion and her own regret weighing her down. As the afternoon grew later, Andy looked at his watch. All right, Ratch, he said gently, it's time to go home. Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at her mother. But Mommy, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't want to leave. Silvia felt her heart shatter into a million pieces at the sight of Rachel's sadness, a stark reminder of the pain she had caused. Andy squatted down, his eyes meeting Rachel's. Your mom needs some time to herself, okay, he said, his voice gentle but firm. Rachel nodded, her lip quivering. Silvia watched the exchange, feeling like an outsider in her own life. The bond between Rachel and Andy was unbreakable, a stark contrast to the fragile threads holding her own relationship with her daughter together. As Rachel climbed into Andy's car, her eyes never leaving Silvia, Silvia felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to face Richard, his smile forced and his eyes cold. You can't keep playing these games, he said, his voice low and angry. I'm not going to stand by while you still pine for him. Silvia's eyes flashed with anger. This isn't about you, she said through clenched teeth. This is Rachel's day. I'm her mother, and I'll do what's best for her. And what about what's best for us? Richard spat, gesturing between the two of them. You can't keep leading me on, Silvia. Silvia felt the heat of his anger, but she remained steadfast. I'm not leading you on, she said, her voice firm. I'm trying to do what's right for Rachel. But what about me? Richard's voice was laced with desperation and anger. What about us? Silvia looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of frustration and sadness. This isn't the time, Richard, she said, her voice tight. Rachel's birthday is about her, not about us. But Richard was beyond reason, his jealousy a living, breathing entity that seemed to fill the space between them. What about when you're with him, he demanded, his voice rising. What am I supposed to do, just sit at home and wait for your leftovers? Silvia's eyes flashed with anger. You knew what you were getting into, she snapped. Rachel comes first, always. Always? Richard's voice was laced with bitterness. Even when you're with him? He spat out the words, unable to hide his jealousy. Silvia sighed heavily, her hand gripping the steering wheel of her car. I divorced Andy for us, Richard, she said, her eyes meeting his in the mirror. But Rachel is still a part of him. You knew that. Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with anger. But you're with me now, he said, his voice strained. Why does he still get to be part of her life? Silvia felt her patience wearing thin. She turned to face him, her voice firm. Because he's Rachel's father, she said, her eyes unwavering. For fuck's sake, Richard, can't you think logically? She loves him. She needs him. The drive home was tense, with Richard's silence a suffocating presence in the car. Silvia's thoughts raced, her heart pounding in her chest. Rachel's sadness and confusion played on repeat in her mind, a constant reminder of the mess she had made. When they pulled up to her apartment, she couldn't wait to get out, to breathe in the cool evening air and escape the oppressive weight of Richard's jealousy. As she unlocked the door, she felt his eyes on her, his resentment a palpable force that seemed to follow her into the empty room. She turned to face him, her voice shaking. You need to go, she said firmly. Richard's eyes narrowed. You can't just send me away like this, he snarled. We need to talk. Silvia took a step back, her hand shaking as she held onto the door handle. Calm yourself first, she said, her voice low and firm. We'll talk later. She didn't want to argue with him, not now, not when Rachel's happiness was still so fresh in her mind. Richard's eyes searched hers, the anger slowly dissipating into something that resembled hurt. He took a deep breath, his hand clenching and unclenching at his side. Fine, he said, his voice tight. But we will talk. Silvia nodded, her own emotions a tumultuous storm. Just go, she murmured, her eyes pleading. Please. With a final, frustrated look, Richard turned and stalked away, leaving Silvia to the silence of her apartment. She leaned against the door, her heart racing, the weight of the day's events pressing down on her shoulders. Rachel's sadness, Andy's resentment, Richard's anger, it was all too much. As the quiet settled in, Silvia's thoughts swirled around her like a tornado of doubt. She walked to the window, her eyes blurred with unshed tears as she stared out at the darkening sky. The streetlights flickered to life below, casting a warm glow on the sidewalk. Was this really what she wanted? Was Richard truly the one she loved? The man she had chosen over her husband and daughter? Her hand trembled as she touched her face, the cool glass of the window offering a brief respite from the turmoil within. She had thought Richard's excitement and passion would fill the emptiness she felt in her marriage, but his possessiveness and jealousy had become a prison she couldn't escape. Every time Rachel talked about her daddy, every time Andy's name was mentioned, Richard's smile would fade and the monster within him would emerge. The sound of Rachel's laughter at the theme park played in her head, a stark contrast to the harshness of Richard's voice. The way Rachel had looked at Andy with such love and trust had cut Silvia to the core. She had destroyed that, all for a love that now felt like a shackle rather than a lifeline. Silvia knew in that moment that she had made a mistake, one that might be too big to fix. The days following Rachel's birthday were a blur of self-reflection and regret for Silvia. The silence in her apartment was deafening, a constant reminder of the life she had chosen over her family. Richard's visits grew more infrequent, the tension between them thickening with each passing day. Silvia felt lost, her thoughts a jumbled mess of doubt and guilt. She knew she needed help. With a deep breath, she picked up her phone and made an appointment with a psychologist. The act of dialing the number felt like a confession, a declaration of her failure as a wife and a mother. As she waited for the appointment, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to her like a shadow. Would talking about her feelings change anything? Would it help her decide what was truly best for Rachel? The day of her appointment arrived, and Silvia sat in the waiting room, her heart racing. The walls were a calming shade of blue, but they did little to soothe the turmoil within her. When the therapist called her name, she felt like she was stepping into a confessional, her secrets and guilt laid bare. She took a seat on the plush couch, her eyes darting around the room as she tried to compose herself. The psychologist, a kind-faced woman with a gentle smile, sat across from her, her notepad at the ready. "Silvia," she began, her voice soothing. "What brings you here today?" Silvia took a deep breath, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I had an affair," she said, the words heavy on her tongue. "It led to my divorce, and now I'm trying to navigate life with my daughter and Richard." The psychologist nodded, her expression empathetic. "Tell me more about the affair," she prompted, her pen poised over the notepad. "What drew you to Richard?" Silvia closed her eyes, her thoughts drifting back to the early days of their relationship. "It was the excitement," she whispered. "Andy and I had grown apart, and Richard made me feel alive again. But it was all a lie. The love I thought I had found was just a distraction from the problems in my marriage." The psychologist leaned in, her gaze understanding. "And what about the divorce?" she asked. "How has that affected you?" Silvia took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. "It's like I've shattered everything," she said. The look in Rachel's eyes when she found out, it's like I've taken her world apart. She paused, her throat tight with unshed tears. "And Andy, he's been so strong for her. He's always been a great father." The psychologist nodded, her expression calm and understanding. "And what about your feelings for Richard?" she asked gently. Silvia's eyes searched the room, avoiding the therapist's gaze. "At first, he was lovely," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Caring, attentive, he made me feel seen and appreciated." Her eyes grew distant, lost in the memories of their early days together. But as time went on, his jealousy grew. She took a shaky breath. "It started small, just little comments here and there about Andy. But it grew into something monstrous." Silvia's gaze fell to her hands, which were tightly clenched in her lap. "He couldn't stand the idea of Rachel loving Andy," she said, her voice thick with regret. "He'd get so possessive whenever she talked about him or when Andy picked her up from weekends. It was like he was trying to erase Andy from her life completely." The psychologist nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And what do you think about Andy?" she asked gently. "How have your feelings for him changed?" Silvia took a moment to consider the question. I don't know," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I thought I had moved on, that what I felt for Richard was true love. But seeing Rachel's pain, it's like I've woken up to the reality of what I've done." She paused, her eyes filling with tears. "Andy has always been there for us, even after everything." The psychologist offered a small, understanding smile. "It's natural to feel conflicted," she said softly. "Divorce and infidelity are complex issues that can stir up a range of emotions. It's important to explore these feelings in a safe space." Silvia took a deep, shaky breath. "The guilt," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's eating me alive." She met the therapist's gaze, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "Every time I see Andy with Rachel, every time he smiles for her, I know he's suffering. And it's all because of me." Her shoulders slumped, the weight of her words heavy on the air. "I thought leaving him would set me free," she continued, her voice trembling. "But all it's done is chain me to a life of regret." The therapist nodded, her expression one of understanding. "I see the pain in his eyes," Silvia went on. "The pain I've caused him. It's like a dagger in my heart, and I can't pull it out." The room was quiet save for the ticking of the clock on the wall, a rhythmic reminder of the time she had wasted. "I don't want Rachel to keep hurting," she said, her voice cracking. "And I don't want Andy to keep suffering because of me." She took a deep, shuddering breath, willing herself to be strong. "What I want is for them to be happy. For Rachel to have a stable, loving home." The psychologist's gaze was steady, her voice a gentle guide. That's a very brave realization, Silvia. Silvia nodded, feeling the first flickers of hope in what felt like an eternity. But it's not enough to just want it, the therapist continued. You must be willing to make the hard choices that will lead to that happiness. Silvia felt the gravity of her words sink in. I know, she murmured. But how do I fix this? The psychologist offered her a kind smile. We'll start by exploring your feelings, she said. Understanding the why behind your actions can help you navigate the what's next. The therapist leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving Silvia's. First, she began, you need to forgive yourself. Silvia's eyes widened in surprise. How? She asked, her voice small. How can I forgive myself for hurting them so much? The therapist offered a gentle smile. Forgiving yourself is the first step in healing, she said. You've acknowledged your mistakes, and that takes courage. Now, you must learn to accept them as part of your journey and move forward. She paused, letting the words settle. It won't be easy, but it's necessary. Silvia nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. I know, she whispered. But I can't bear the thought of Rachel and Andy hurting. The psychologist leaned in, her voice gentle but firm. You cannot control their pain, Silvia, she said. But you can control your actions. By choosing to forgive yourself, you're freeing them to do the same. It's a powerful step towards healing. Silvia took a deep breath, the concept of self-forgiveness feeling as elusive as a mirage in the desert of her guilt. Yet, the therapist's words resonated within her, a distant beacon of hope. But what about Richard, she asked, her voice filled with trepidation. Should I stay with him? The psychologist's expression grew thoughtful. That's a decision only you can make, she said. But I'd advise you to consider what truly makes you happy, and if your relationship with Richard is conducive to Rachel's well-being. Silvia nodded, her eyes brimming with understanding. The therapist's words echoed in her mind like a clarion call, urging her to prioritize Rachel's needs. I need to think, she murmured, her voice barely audible. I need to decide if I want to keep hurting them or if I want to try to fix what I've broken. The therapist nodded, her eyes never leaving Silvia's. The last step in this process is to ask forgiveness, she said gently. From Andy, from Rachel. Silvia's heart skipped a beat. Forgiveness. It seemed like a distant, unattainable ideal, but the thought of it offered a glimmer of hope. They may not be ready to forgive you, the therapist continued, but the act of asking can be incredibly powerful. Silvia took a deep breath, her thoughts racing. How do I do that? She whispered. How do I tell them I'm sorry? The psychologist's eyes remained steadfast on hers. With sincerity and patience, she advised. You need to be genuine in your apology, and accept that it may take time for them to heal. You cannot rush their process. Silvia nodded, feeling the weight of the words sink in. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she couldn't change the past. All she could do was strive for a better future. The therapist's advice was a beacon of clarity in the chaos of her thoughts. But what if they don't forgive me, she whispered, the fear stark in her voice. The psychologist's expression remained calm. Forgiveness is a gift that people give when they're ready, she said gently. Your job is to offer your apology with sincerity and without expectation. It's about acknowledging the pain you've caused and committing to change. Silvia nodded, the gravity of her situation sinking in. As she left the office, the crisp fall air hit her like a slap in the face, bringing with it a sense of clarity. Rachel's birthday had been a wake-up call, a stark reminder of the love she had sacrificed. She knew what she had to do. The drive home was filled with trepidation. What would Richard say when she told him she wanted to end their relationship? Would he be understanding, or would he lash out in anger? She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation. When she reached her apartment, Richard was waiting, pacing the floor like a caged animal. His eyes searched hers, looking for a hint of the love they once shared. But all he saw was the turmoil of guilt and regret. Silvia's voice trembled as she spoke. "We need to talk," she began, her heart racing. "What's wrong?" Richard's voice was a mix of concern and suspicion. Silvia took a deep breath, her eyes searching for the right words. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice shaking. "I can't keep living a lie, not when Rachel's happiness is at stake." Richard's brows furrowed, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" Silvia took a step closer to him, her voice firm despite the tremor. "I've been to see someone," she said. "A therapist. And I realized that Rachel's happiness is more important than anything else. I can't keep choosing you over her, or over the family I destroyed." Richard's face contorted in a mix of anger and disbelief. "You're going to throw us away just like that," he spat. "After everything we've been through?" Silvia felt a lump form in her throat, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not about us, Richard," she replied, her eyes brimming with tears. "It's about Rachel. She needs stability, love, a family that's not torn apart by jealousy and spite." Richard's expression shifted from anger to desperation. He reached out to her, but Silvia took a step back. "Please," he begged. "We can work through this. I'll change, I promise." Silvia felt the final threads of her resolve start to fray, but she knew she had to be firm. "No, Richard," she said, her voice shaking. "This isn't about you changing. It's about what's best for Rachel." Richard's hand fell to his side, his eyes searching hers for a glimmer of hope. But all he found was sadness and determination. "What if we break up and Rachel never gets over it?" he asked, his voice cracking. "What if she grows up hating you for this?" Silvia swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. "That's a risk I'm willing to take," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "Because maybe, just maybe, Rachel will learn from this. Maybe she'll know that love isn't about possession or control, but about making sacrifices for those we care about." Richard's eyes flashed with anger, his fists clenching at his sides. "You think you can just leave me for them?" he spat, the venom in his voice making Silvia's heart ache. "After all I've done for you?" Silvia flinched at his accusatory tone, her own anger simmering below the surface. "You're not listening," she said, her voice strained. "This isn't about you or me. It's about Rachel. She's lost so much because of us." The living room grew tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations and pain. Richard's face fell, the anger slowly draining away. "What about us?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What happens to us?" Silvia's heart felt as if it was being torn in two. She took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm sorry, Richard," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I can't continue this relationship. It's not fair to any of us, especially Rachel." She stepped closer, placing a trembling hand on his arm. "You deserve someone who can give you all of themselves, without the shadow of guilt hanging over us." Before she could finish her sentence, Richard's hand shot out, slapping her across the face with a force that sent her reeling. The sound echoed through the apartment, a stark reminder of the volatile nature of their relationship. Silvia's cheek stung, tears spilling over her lashes as she stared at him in shock. "How dare you?" Richard's voice was laced with fury. "You're the one who cheated, who destroyed our family." He stepped closer, his eyes boring into hers. "You're the one who's going to go back to that spineless excuse of a husband, playing the victim when you're the one who did this to us." Silvia's cheek stung, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she straightened her posture, her voice firm despite the tears that blurred her vision. "That's enough," she said. "I won't let you speak about Andy like that." The rage in Richard's eyes grew, his grip tightening on her arm. "Oh, so now you're defending him," he spat, his words a toxic mix of anger and betrayal. "After all the times he ignored you, all the times he put his job before his family?" Silvia felt a fire ignite within her, her hand flying out on its own accord. The slap echoed through the room, as surprising to her as it was to Richard. His face went slack for a moment before the anger flooded back in, his eyes darkening. "How dare you," he growled, his grip on her arm tightening. "You're the one who couldn't keep your legs closed, who threw away your marriage for a quick fuck." Silvia felt the sting of his words, but her anger was stronger. She slapped him back, hard enough to leave a red handprint on his cheek. "Get out," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You're not welcome here anymore." Richard stared at her, shock and anger warring on his face. But he knew he had crossed a line. He turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Silvia sank to the floor, her legs giving out beneath her. The sobs came then, deep and racking, as she realized the full extent of the mess she had made. How had she ever thought Richard was the love of her life? How could she have been so blind to his controlling ways? The taste of his harsh words lingered on her skin, a bitter reminder of her own folly. She had thrown away her marriage, her family, for a mirage of passion and excitement. And in the process, she had hurt Andy and Rachel more than she could ever imagine. Rachel, her sweet, innocent daughter, who now had to navigate the murky waters of a broken home. The weight of her guilt was unbearable, and she knew she had to make things right. Silvia took a deep, shuddering breath and stood up, wiping away her tears. She looked around the apartment, the walls seeming to close in on her. This place no longer felt like home, but rather a prison of her own making. She needed to get out, to breathe in the cool night air and think clearly. Grabbing her keys, she left the apartment, the echoes of Richard's anger still ringing in her ears. Walking through the quiet streets, Silvia felt a newfound sense of determination. She would make amends, starting with Rachel. She would be the mother she deserved, the one who put her needs first. The thought of Rachel's little face, filled with confusion and pain, was the fuel that propelled her forward. The night was cool, the stars twinkling above her like distant witnesses to her turmoil. Each step brought her closer to the truth she had been avoiding. She had hurt the people she loved the most. Rachel's trusting gaze, Andy's quiet strength, all tarnished by her selfishness. Silvia reached the park, the swings Rachel had once loved to play on swaying gently in the breeze. She sat on the bench, her thoughts racing. How could she possibly fix this? The words of the therapist echoed in her mind, sincerity and patience. But how long could Rachel be patient? How long would Andy even consider forgiveness? Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of laughter, and she turned to see a father playing with his daughter. The sight stabbed at her heart, a painful reminder of what she had lost. Silvia knew she couldn't change the past, but she could strive to make a better future for Rachel. The next morning, she woke up with a newfound resolve. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready to face it. She called Rachel's school, asking to speak with the principal. After a tense conversation, she arranged a meeting to discuss Rachel's emotional state and her desire to be more involved in her life. Silvia's hands shook as she dressed for the meeting, the gravity of the situation weighing on her. As she sat in the principal's office, she felt the weight of her decisions press down on her. Rachel's innocent face flashed in her mind, a silent plea for her mother to fix this. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice trembling. The principal, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Jenkins, listened intently as Silvia recounted her mistakes. The room grew heavy with the silence that followed, until Mrs. Jenkins leaned forward, her eyes filled with empathy. "Silvia," she said gently, "I understand that this is a difficult time for you, but what's most important now is Rachel's well-being." Silvia nodded fervently, clutching the edge of her seat. "I know," she murmured. "And I want to do everything in my power to make it right for her." Mrs. Jenkins offered a small smile. "That's a good start," she said. "Consistency and open communication are key. Rachel needs to know that she can rely on you, even when things get tough." Silvia nodded, the gravity of the advice settling in her chest. "I'll do anything," she said, her voice earnest. "I'll go to counseling, I'll support her in every way possible. Mrs. Jenkins nodded. It's a step in the right direction, she said. But remember, Rachel's healing will take time. Be patient with her, and with yourself. Silvia left the school feeling a mix of hope and dread. The path to redemption was clear, but the journey ahead was fraught with uncertainty. Driving home, her thoughts turned to Andy. The idea of facing him, of laying bare her soul and begging for his forgiveness, was terrifying. But she knew it was necessary. Rachel's happiness was worth the risk. She pulled into their old driveway, her heart racing as she approached the door. Andy answered, his eyes a storm of confusion and anger. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. Silvia's voice was barely a whisper. "We need to talk," she said. "Please, let me in." The house felt like a museum of lost memories, every corner holding a ghost of a happier time. Silvia's heart ached as she walked through the hallway, her eyes lingering on the framed family photos that now seemed like relics of a bygone era. Rachel's laughter echoed in her mind, a painful reminder of the joy she had stolen from her daughter's life. When she handed Rachel over to Andy, his eyes searched hers, looking for an explanation, a reason for her sudden change of heart. Silvia could see the wall he had built around himself, a fortress to protect the love he had for Rachel from the pain she had caused. "I ended things with Richard," she said quietly, her voice cracking. "I realized that Rachel is what matters most." Andy's eyes searched hers for any trace of deceit, any hint that this was just another ploy to manipulate him. His silence was deafening. Rachel looked up at her mother with curiosity, not fully grasping the gravity of her words. "I'm sorry," Silvia choked out, the words sticking in her throat like shards of glass. "I know sorry isn't enough, but I need you to know how much I regret my actions." She took a step closer, her hand outstretched, trembling with hope and fear. After a moment that felt like an eternity, Andy stepped aside, his jaw tight. Silvia took it as an invitation and entered the house, her heart hammering in her chest. Rachel looked up from her coloring book, her eyes wide with curiosity. She hadn't seen her parents together like this in a long time. Silvia took a seat at the kitchen table, her hands clutching the edge of the chair. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken words. Andy leaned against the counter, his arms folded across his chest. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and measured. Swallowing her fear, Silvia met his gaze. "I want to apologize," she said, her voice shaking. "For everything. For the pain I've caused, for the lies I've told. I want you to know that I never meant to hurt you or Rachel. I was lost, and I made a terrible mistake." Andy's expression remained unreadable, but Silvia could see the hurt in his eyes. He sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Silvia," he said, his voice laced with weariness. "But I'm trying." Rachel looked up at her father, her tiny hand reaching out to pat his leg. Silvia's heart clenched at the sight of her daughter's innocence. "I understand," she murmured, her eyes filling with tears. "But I need you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right." Andy's eyes searched hers, looking for the truth she hoped was there. He took a deep breath, his expression softening slightly. "Rachel's the only reason I'm even considering this," he said, his voice gruff. "But I can't promise anything, Silvia. The trust between us is broken." Silvia nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll work every day to rebuild it." Rachel looked back and forth between her parents, her small brow furrowed in confusion. Silvia's heart clenched, and she knew she had to be the one to break the silence. "Can we sit down?" she asked, her voice trembling. Andy hesitated before nodding, taking a seat across from her at the kitchen table. Rachel climbed onto his lap, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Silvia felt the warmth of their bond and realized how much she had missed it. Andy took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers with a mix of anger and sadness. "When you told me about the divorce, I couldn't believe it," he began, his voice measured. I went over everything we had done, every argument, every silent dinner, every time I worked late. I thought I was the one who had failed. Rachel looked up at her father, her eyes wide with concern. Silvia's heart shattered at the realization of the depth of his pain. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. I never meant to hurt you like this. Andy's eyes searched hers, looking for a semblance of the woman he had once loved. When I found out about the affair, he said, his voice tight with restrained emotion, my whole world crumbled. You went from being my wife, my partner, to just Rachel's mother. Silvia felt the sting of his words, her eyes brimming with tears. I know, she whispered, her voice cracking. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging for it. For Rachel's sake. Andy's gaze softened slightly, his arms tightening around Rachel. You're right, he said after a long moment. For now, we need to focus on Rachel. She's the one who suffered the most. Rachel looked up at the sound of her name, her eyes flickering between her parents. But Silvia, he continued, his voice firm but not unkind, you need to understand that what you've done can't be erased. It's changed everything. Rachel squirmed in his lap, sensing the tension in the room. Silvia nodded, her eyes fixed on Rachel's tiny hands, playing with Andy's shirt. I know, she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. But I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to both of you. Andy's eyes searched hers, the anger slowly giving way to a deep sadness. For Rachel's sake, he said, we can work on a co-parenting plan. Silvia felt a flicker of hope in the cold abyss of her regret. Thank you, she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Rachel looked up at the sound, her eyes questioning. Daddy, she whispered, her voice small and hopeful. Can Mommy come home? Andy's heart skipped a beat at Rachel's plea. He had been trying to keep the situation as stable as possible for her, not wanting to burden her with the weight of their shattered marriage. But her words pierced through the armor he had built around his own pain. He knew Rachel missed Silvia, missed the complete family unit she had once known. He took a deep breath, his gaze flickering to Silvia's tear-stained face. Rachel had become the bridge between them, the tiny thread of hope that remained untouched by the storm of their separation. Silvia held her breath, her eyes filled with hope and fear. Rachel's innocent question hung in the air, a stark reminder of the reality they were facing. I don't know, sweetheart, Andy said finally, his voice gruff. Rachel's bottom lip quivered, and he knew he couldn't bear to see her hurt anymore. But we can talk about it, he added, looking up at Silvia. Her eyes searched his, desperate for any sign of leniency. We'll work on it, he said, his voice firm. Rachel's eyes lit up, and she threw her arms around Silvia's neck, showering her with kisses. Silvia's heart felt as if it would burst with the sudden rush of love and hope. They decided to ease back into a routine, with Silvia moving into the guest room to maintain boundaries. Rachel's excitement was palpable, and she clung to Silvia's leg as she set up her space, asking questions about bedtime stories and breakfast together. The simple act of being under the same roof again brought a bittersweet warmth to Silvia's chest. Dinners were tense, filled with forced smiles and polite conversation. Rachel chattered away, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension between her parents. Silvia took the time to listen to Rachel's tales from school, her heart swelling with love and guilt in equal measure. She watched as Andy patiently helped Rachel with her homework, the picture of the devoted father she had always known him to be. How could she have ever thought she could betray someone like him? Andy had been her rock through it all, the one who had held her hand during Rachel's birth, who had made her laugh when she thought she had forgotten how, who had held her when she wept in the middle of the night. And she had thrown it all away for a fleeting affair. One day, as Andy picked Rachel up from school, Silvia drove by to drop off Rachel's forgotten lunchbox. She saw him from a distance, talking with Rachel's teacher, Miss Thompson. She was a lovely woman, warm and kind, with a gentle smile that could calm even the wildest of kindergarten spirits. But today, that smile was directed at Andy in a way that made Silvia's stomach drop. Silvia parked the car and approached them slowly, her heart racing. As she got closer, she noticed the way Miss Thompson leaned into Andy's personal space, her laughter a little too flirtatious. Rachel was playing with her friends nearby, oblivious to the tension. Andy's eyes lit up when he saw Silvia, and he excused himself from the conversation, walking towards her with Rachel in tow. "Thanks for bringing this," he said, taking the lunchbox with a forced smile. Silvia's stomach twisted into knots as she watched Miss Thompson's eyes follow Andy's movements. "Miss Thompson was just saying how much Rachel's improved in class," he added, his voice tight. Rachel looked up at Silvia, her eyes shining. "Mommy, did you see what Miss Thompson said?" Silvia's heart lurched. She had never felt so out of place, so unworthy of her own daughter's love. "I did," she murmured, her gaze flicking back to the teacher. Miss Thompson's smile was warm, but her eyes held a glint that Silvia recognized all too well. The woman's beauty was undeniable, and suddenly, she felt like the invisible third wheel in her own family. Andy seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of the conversation, his focus solely on Rachel. But Silvia couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled in her stomach. She knew she had no right to be jealous, not after what she had done. Yet the sight of another woman, especially one who could easily win Rachel's affection, threatening to take Andy away from her was too much. For the next few days, Silvia threw herself into her work and Rachel's life, trying to banish the image of Andy and Miss Thompson's interaction. She took Rachel to the zoo, helped with her homework, and even tried to cook her favorite meals. Rachel's eyes lit up with each gesture, but the shadow of Mrs. Thompson lingered in the corners of Silvia's mind, a constant reminder of the potential loss she faced. One evening, Rachel was in bed, and Silvia sat in the living room, lost in thought. She heard the faint sound of a doorbell ringing from downstairs. Andy's footsteps echoed through the hallway, followed by a soft, unfamiliar voice. Silvia's heart raced, and she strained to hear the conversation. It was Miss Thompson, bringing over Rachel's forgotten art project. She watched from the top of the stairs as Andy thanked her, his smile polite but guarded. The sight of Miss Thompson's kindness and beauty stung Silvia with jealousy, a feeling she had no right to feel. She had been the one to betray their trust, to tear apart their family. Yet here she was, feeling possessive over her husband and their shared history. She knew she had to tread carefully, for Rachel's sake. Silvia watched from the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest, as Miss Thompson handed the art project to Andy. The warmth of Rachel's room was a stark contrast to the chill that had settled over Silvia. She knew her inability to express her fears was a self-inflicted prison, a silent punishment for her infidelity. After Rachel had been tucked in, she took a deep breath and approached Andy, who was still standing by the door, lost in thought. "Can we talk?" she asked tentatively, her voice barely above a whisper. Andy's eyes snapped to hers, and she saw a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze before he nodded, gesturing for her to sit. Silvia's heart pounded in her chest as they moved into the living room, the couch feeling like a mile away from the safety of Rachel's embrace. "I saw you with Miss Thompson today," she began, her voice shaking slightly. Andy turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Is there something I should know?" Andy sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's nothing, Silvia," he said, his voice weary. "She's just Rachel's teacher." But Silvia could see the defensiveness in his posture, the way he held himself slightly apart. The tears came suddenly, spilling down her cheeks like a dam had broken. "I know," she sobbed, "I know I've no right to be jealous. But seeing her with you, so happy and caring, it just hurts." She felt the weight of her confession, the truth of her fears laid bare. Rachel's happiness was the most important thing, but the thought of Andy moving on, of Rachel calling someone else mom, was unbearable. Andy's expression softened as he took a step towards her. "Silvia," he said gently, reaching out to cup her face in his hands. His touch was warm, familiar, and for a moment, she allowed herself to lean into it. "You're Rachel's mother, always will be. No one can change that." He paused, his thumbs wiping away her tears. I'm not looking to replace you. The words were a balm to Silvia's soul, and she leaned into his embrace, feeling his arms wrap around her tightly. It had been so long since she had felt his warmth, his solid presence, that she had forgotten the comfort it brought. Rachel's laughter echoed in the hallway, a reminder of what she was fighting for. She clung to him, her sobs subsiding as his heartbeat soothed her. I'm so scared, she whispered into his chest, her voice muffled by his shirt. I've hurt you both so much. I know I don't deserve you, but I can't bear the thought of losing you completely. Andy's arms tightened around her. You haven't lost us, he said, his voice a gentle rumble. We're still a family, even if it's not in the same way. Rachel's laughter from the other room was a poignant reminder of what they were fighting to preserve. Silvia pulled back, her eyes searching his. In that moment, she saw the love, the hurt, the anger, and the hope all rolled into one complex web of emotion. Without another word, she leaned in, her eyes closing as her lips found his. Andy stiffened for a second, surprised, before his arms slid around her more tightly. He kissed her back, his own fears and regrets momentarily forgotten. The kiss grew deeper, more urgent, as Silvia's hands began to unbutton his shirt, her trembling fingers slipping the fabric away from his warm skin. Andy's own hands mirrored her actions, his eyes never leaving hers as they both slowly, almost reverently, removed their clothes. The air grew thick with the scent of their desire, a potent reminder of the bond that still remained between them despite the tumult of the past few months. As they stood before each other, their bare skin touching for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the weight of their past transgressions seemed to melt away. Silvia felt a rush of emotions overwhelm her: guilt, regret, hope, and an intense love that had never truly disappeared. Andy's eyes searched hers, his own feelings a tumultuous sea of anger, pain, and a longing that he had tried to bury. And then, without a word, he bent down, his arms sliding beneath her, and lifted her into his embrace. Her legs wrapped around his waist, and she could feel the strength in his muscles as he carried her down the hallway. Rachel's giggles from her bedroom grew faint, the door a barrier between their newfound intimacy and the innocence of their daughter. Silvia's heart raced as Andy's kiss grew more fervent, his lips moving from hers to nip at her neck, sending shivers down her spine. The bedroom door creaked open, and he laid her gently on the bed, his eyes never leaving hers. For a brief, blissful moment, it was as if the world had stopped, and they were the only two people in existence. Rachel's voice was a distant lullaby, a sweet counterpoint to the passion building between them. Silvia's hands roamed over Andy's bare chest, feeling the muscles that she had missed so much. His touch was tender yet firm, a silent declaration of the love that had been buried beneath the rubble of their shattered trust. Their bodies intertwined, a dance of redemption and regret, each caress a silent apology and promise to do better. The bed squeaked faintly as they moved together, their whispers and gasps a stark contrast to Rachel's even breathing down the hall. The tension that had been building within her for months finally reached its peak. She gripped the sheets, her eyes squeezed shut as wave after wave of pleasure washed over her. Silvia felt Andy's body tense, his breathing growing ragged as he matched her rhythm, his own release just within reach. The room was filled with the scent of their desire, a potent mix of sweat and love that seemed to cling to their skin. As the last tremors of passion subsided, she opened her eyes to find him staring at her, his own gaze filled with a maelstrom of emotions she had not seen in so long. Without a word, she began to weep, her body convulsing with sobs that she had held in for far too long. He gathered her into his arms, his embrace strong yet gentle, and she buried her face into his neck, the warmth of his skin soothing her as she let go of the guilt and pain that had consumed her. "I'm sorry," she choked out, her voice muffled by his skin. "I'm so sorry for what I've done to us," to Rachel. His arms tightened around her, and she felt his own tears fall onto her hair. "You don't know how much I've missed this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "How much I've missed you." Andy's throat was tight as he held her, the warmth of her body and the sweet scent of her skin overwhelming. He didn't trust his voice, so he simply nodded, pressing a kiss to her forehead. They lay there in silence for a while, the quiet only broken by Rachel's occasional giggles from her room. As the minutes ticked by, Silvia grew more still, her breathing evening out. Andy watched her, his heart aching. He knew this one act of passion wouldn't erase the pain she had caused, but he couldn't deny the connection that still pulsed between them. He had missed her, so much more than he had allowed himself to admit. The love he had felt for her had not disappeared entirely, but rather had morphed into a complex web of anger, hurt, and now, hope. Gently, he brushed her hair back from her face, his thumb tracing the contours of her cheek. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him with an intensity that took his breath away. In that moment, Silvia knew she had made a mistake, a terrible one that had almost cost her everything. Yet, as she stared into the depths of Andy's gaze, she realized that the love she had for him was as potent and fierce as it had ever been. "Is there still a little love left in your heart for me?" she whispered, the question hanging in the air like a delicate thread that could so easily be snapped by the weight of his anger or disappointment. Andy's expression was unreadable, his eyes searching hers for what felt like an eternity. Rachel's muffled laughter from her room served as a stark reminder of the fragile happiness that had once been theirs. "Silvia," he finally spoke, his voice filled with the gravity of his words. "You're the only woman I've ever loved, and I always will. But that doesn't mean everything's just going to go back to the way it was." His arms around her tightened almost imperceptibly. "We have to rebuild the trust, brick by brick." Her heart swelled with a mix of love and trepidation at his words. Despite the turmoil of emotions, she felt a serene calmness in her core. The love of her life still loved her, even after her most grievous of mistakes. It was a beacon of hope amidst the wreckage of their marriage. Silvia nodded solemnly, her eyes never leaving his. "I know," she said softly, "and I'll do whatever it takes." They lay in silence for a few moments more, their hearts beating in sync, a rhythm that had played out over the years of their relationship. The weight of the decision to rebuild was not lost on either of them. Rachel's voice grew faint, a gentle lullaby to their tumultuous evening. Andy's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing in a silent promise of support and commitment to the long road ahead. The following days saw Silvia make a concerted effort to re-establish the bonds that had been so carelessly broken. She took Rachel to school, helped her with homework, and even started to prepare meals for the family, all under Rachel's curious yet hopeful gaze. The air was filled with a tentative peace, as Rachel began to see more of her mother's presence in their lives. Andy watched from the sidelines, his emotions a tumultuous storm. He wanted to believe in Silvia's transformation, but the scars of her betrayal ran deep. Yet, Rachel's joy at her mother's attentiveness was a balm to his soul. He couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope, a spark that threatened to ignite the love he had buried for so long. Over the next 6 months, Silvia remained steadfast in her efforts. Rachel's eyes lit up every time her mother walked through the door, and her laughter filled the house again. The dinner table was no longer a battleground, but a place of shared stories and gentle teasing. The sound of Rachel calling out "Mommy" echoed through the hallways, a sweet symphony that had been absent for too long. Andy watched the transformation with a mix of skepticism and hope. He saw the way Rachel's smile grew wider each day, the way she clung to Silvia's leg, seeking comfort and reassurance. The changes in Silvia were undeniable. She had quit her high-stress job to focus on Rachel and her art, her true passion. She had even started volunteering at Rachel's school, much to Miss Thompson's surprise, who had become nothing more than a friendly face to Rachel, as Silvia had hoped. Their evenings were spent together now, the three of them, with Silvia often curling up on the couch with Rachel to read bedtime stories. Andy found himself smiling more, laughing at Rachel's antics, his heart swelling with love for his daughter and a cautious affection for the woman who had hurt him so deeply. It was as though Rachel had become the glue holding their fractured family together. The intimacy between Silvia and Andy grew gradually, a slow burn that seemed to warm the entire house. They talked more, shared more, and the tension that had once been so palpable began to dissipate. He noticed the way her eyes lit up when Rachel spoke, the gentle curve of her smile as she watched their daughter play. It was a smile that had once been reserved for him, and it stirred something long dormant within his chest. One evening, as Rachel was fast asleep, Silvia approached Andy in the kitchen. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the room. "Thank you for giving me another chance to make this right." Andy, wiping down the counters with a towel, paused and turned to face her. His eyes searched hers, looking for sincerity, and finding it, he nodded. "I'm not perfect, Silvia," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his own imperfections. "I've made my share of mistakes. And Rachel, she deserves a happy family. If that means giving this another shot, then that's what I'll do." Silvia stepped closer to him, her bare feet silent on the cool kitchen tiles. Without another word, she reached up and placed her hands on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. And then, she leaned in and kissed him, her eyes closed, her heart racing. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid the other might pull away. But as Andy's arms wound around her waist, pulling her closer, the kiss grew deeper, more urgent. Their bodies melded together as they stumbled towards Rachel's bedroom, the door a silent sentinel guarding the innocence within. They moved with the stealth of shadows, their whispers a secret language that Rachel could not understand. Rachel lay there, her small chest rising and falling in the gentle rhythm of sleep, her favorite teddy bear clutched to her side. The sight of their daughter brought a moment of clarity, a reminder of the fragility of their newfound peace. With a silent nod, they retreated to the guest room, their passion now a fiery embrace. Their lovemaking was a symphony of whispers and restrained sighs, the fear of waking Rachel a constant undercurrent to their passion. The room was bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, casting long shadows across the floor. They moved together in a dance of redemption, their bodies speaking the apologies that had remained unspoken. Weeks passed, and the air grew thicker with tension and hope. The mundane routine of life painted a veneer of normalcy over the cracks of their shattered trust. And then one morning, Silvia awoke to the all-too-familiar feeling of nausea, a sensation that sent a shiver down her spine. It was the same feeling she had experienced when she had first conceived Rachel. She clutched the edge of the bed, the room spinning around her, as the gravity of the situation settled like a rock in the pit of her stomach. With trembling hands, she reached for the pregnancy test hidden in the drawer of the guest bathroom, the plastic cold and unyielding in her grip. Her eyes darted towards Rachel's room, ensuring she was still lost in the comfort of sleep, before she shut the door. The minutes stretched on as she waited for the result, her mind racing with a tornado of thoughts. What if Andy didn't want another child? What if Rachel resented the sibling born from a union fraught with so much pain? The two pink lines emerged like a silent declaration, stark against the white plastic. Silvia stared, her heart hammering in her chest, a mix of elation and fear coursing through her veins. She was pregnant. Another little life grew inside her, a symbol of a second chance at happiness, at redemption. Yet, the shadow of doubt loomed large. Would Andy see this as a gift or a curse? Her hand hovered over her belly, feeling the slightest swell. Rachel's giggles from the next room reminded her of the stakes. She had to tell Andy, to gauge his reaction, to gauge if their fragile trust could withstand this new addition. With trembling hands, she slipped the test into her pocket and padded over to Rachel's room. The sight of her sleeping daughter, her tiny fingers curled into a fist, filled her with a fierce protectiveness and love. This child, she thought, would never know the pain she had caused. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and walked back to her own room where Andy lay, lost in the quiet of his slumber. The digital clock on the bedside table read 6:45 a.m., the world outside still wrapped in the early morning haze. Silvia sat on the edge of the bed, the softness of the mattress seemingly amplifying the gravity of the moment. She took Andy's hand in hers, his skin warm and comforting. "Andy," she whispered, gently shaking him. "I need to tell you something." His eyes fluttered open, and she could see the sleep dissipating from them, replaced by curiosity and concern. "What is it?" he asked, his voice still thick with rest. Silvia took a deep breath and blurted out the words that had been choking her all morning. "I'm pregnant." The room seemed to hold its breath for an eternity before Rachel's laughter from the next room pierced the silence. Andy's hand went slack in hers, his eyes widening. For a moment, all he could do was stare at her, the shock rendering him mute. Then, as the reality of the situation dawned on him, a smile began to spread across his face. It was a smile of pure joy, one that reached his eyes and transformed his entire countenance. He sat up, pulling her into a tight embrace, her heart thumping wildly against his chest. "We're going to have another baby," he whispered in her ear, his voice filled with wonder. Silvia's eyes widened, the tears that had been threatening to spill over now a river flowing down her cheeks. But these were not tears of pain or fear, they were tears of relief and hope. Rachel's laughter grew louder, a sweet serenade to their moment of truth. Andy pulled away, his gaze searching hers, trying to understand the source of her sobs. "Why are you crying?" he asked, his own eyes misting over with unshed tears. Silvia took a shaky breath, her hand still pressed to her mouth. "I'm just so happy," she managed to say. "But I'm also so scared." Andy wiped away a stray tear with his thumb, his own eyes glistening. "Scared of what?" Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Scared that after everything I've done, I won't be worthy of this baby. That you won't want me to have your child." She searched his face, desperation swirling in her eyes. Andy's expression softened as he took her hand in his. "Silvia, you're the mother of my child. You've made mistakes, yes, but that doesn't change the fact that Rachel is the best thing that's ever happened to us. And now we have another chance." With those words, she crumpled into his embrace, her body racked with sobs that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 regrets. Andy held her close, whispering reassurances into her hair, his heart aching for her pain. He knew he still loved her, despite her infidelity. Their love was a tapestry, frayed in places but not destroyed. After several moments, her sobs began to subside, and she pulled back to look into his eyes. "But Rachel," she sniffled, "what will she think?" Andy's smile was tender. "Rachel is a smart girl, she'll understand. And she loves you, Silvia. More than anything, she wants her mommy to be happy." Silvia nodded, her eyes still shimmering with tears. He leaned in and kissed her forehead, his lips lingering there for a moment. "Now, go tell her," he whispered. "She deserves to know that her family is growing." With a tremble in her step, Silvia walked into Rachel's room, her heart in her throat. Rachel's eyes grew wide as she took in her mother's flushed cheeks and shaky hands. "Mommy," Rachel said, her voice still thick with sleep. "Is everything okay?" Silvia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the secret she had been carrying dissipate as she spoke. "Rachel, sweetheart," she began, her voice quivering. "I have something very important to tell you." Rachel sat up in bed, her eyes locked onto Silvia's, curiosity shifting to concern. "What is it?" she asked, her voice small. "Daddy and I are going to have a baby," Silvia managed to say, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. Rachel's eyes widened, and for a moment, she remained utterly still. Then, with a squeal of excitement, she threw her arms around Silvia's neck, squeezing her tight. "A baby brother or sister," she exclaimed, her face lighting up with pure joy. The tightness in Silvia's chest began to ease, Rachel's enthusiasm a balm to her soul. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of happiness and anticipation. Rachel could barely contain herself, telling everyone she encountered about her impending sibling. Silvia watched her daughter with a mix of amazement and gratitude. Rachel had no idea of the tumultuous journey her parents had taken to reach this point, but her innocence was a beacon of hope that perhaps they could indeed heal their fractured family. As the day of Silvia's first prenatal appointment approached, the excitement grew palpable. Rachel chattered endlessly about the baby, peppering Silvia with questions about what it would be like to have a sibling. Andy, though still guarded, couldn't help but share in Rachel's excitement. He took a day off work, eager to be there for Silvia as they took this critical step. The hospital's corridors were a stark contrast to the warmth of their home. The antiseptic smell and the hum of machines were a stark reminder of the seriousness of the situation. Rachel's hand was clammy in Andy's as they walked alongside Silvia, who tried to put on a brave face despite her nerves. They arrived at the OBGYN's office, and Rachel's wide-eyed curiosity filled the room. Andy held Silvia's hand tightly as they sat in the waiting room, Rachel flipping through a children's book, her excitement contagious. Silvia felt a knot form in her stomach, not just from the pregnancy, but from the anxiety of what the doctor might say. Would everything be all right with the baby? Would Rachel truly accept a sibling conceived from a place of love, despite the turmoil that had led to it? As the nurse called Silvia's name, Rachel looked up expectantly. Silvia took one last deep breath, her hand slipping from Rachel's grasp as she rose to her feet. "We'll be right back, sweetie," she said, her voice a little too bright. Rachel nodded, her eyes never leaving Silvia's until the door closed behind them. Andy squeezed her hand as they followed the nurse down the hall, his grip tight and reassuring. Silvia's heart thudded in her chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. The doctor's office was small and warm, the walls adorned with cheerful baby prints and the sound of a heartbeat from the fetal Doppler machine a comforting rhythm. As the doctor began the ultrasound, Silvia couldn't help but hold her breath. Andy sat beside her, his eyes fixed on the screen, Rachel's tiny hand in his. The room was filled with a tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. The doctor's voice was calm and soothing as she pointed out the baby's developing features, but the gravity of the situation was not lost on them. The image flickered to life, and there it was, a tiny, pulsing heartbeat, the undeniable proof of new life. Rachel's eyes grew wide as she stared, transfixed, her grip on Andy's hand tightening. "It's a baby," she whispered in awe, her voice filled with the wonder of discovery. Silvia felt the tears threaten again, her heart swelling with a mix of joy and fear. Could she really do this? Could she be a mother again, after all she had done? Andy's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "Everything looks perfect," the doctor said, smiling at their shared amazement. Rachel's laughter bubbled over, a sweet sound that seemed to fill the room with light. Silvia's eyes met Andy's, and she saw the unspoken hope in his gaze. Perhaps this was their chance, a new beginning amidst the wreckage of their past. On the ride home, Rachel's chatter about her baby sibling filled the car, a constant reminder of the innocence that had been their compass through this storm. As Rachel drifted off to sleep, Andy finally turned to Silvia, his expression serious. "Do you mind if we talk?" His voice was tentative, the gravity of his words heavy in the quiet of the car. Silvia nodded, her stomach flipping with anticipation. He reached into the center console and pulled out a small velvet box, his thumb rubbing nervously over the soft fabric. Silvia's eyes widened as he opened it to reveal her wedding ring, gleaming in the soft glow of the car's interior light. "Silvia," he began, his voice low and earnest. "I know we've been through hell and back. But seeing you with Rachel today, seeing that spark in your eyes, I want that back." He took a deep breath, his hand shaking as he continued. "I want us to be a family again. I want to marry you. For Rachel, for this baby, for us." Silvia felt a lump form in her throat as she stared at the ring, a symbol of their once unshakable bond. The car's steady hum seemed to fade into the background as she took in the gravity of his proposal. "Andy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She turned to face him, her eyes brimming with tears. "Are you sure?" He nodded solemnly, reaching over to wipe away a stray tear that had escaped down her cheek. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he said, his own eyes glistening with hope. "I don't expect it to be easy, and I know we have a long road ahead of us, but I believe we can do it. For Rachel, for this baby, for us." Silvia felt the weight of his words, the sincerity in his voice. Her hand hovered over the ring, a tangible connection to a past she had almost destroyed. She took a deep breath, the air in the car suddenly thick with anticipation. "Andy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You deserve so much better than me. After what I've done, I can't imagine you would ever want to marry me again." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and love. "Silvia," he said firmly, "you're Rachel's mother. And you're the woman I fell in love with. Yes, you made a mistake, but we all do. What's important is that you're trying to make things right." His hand closed over hers, the ring a silent reminder of the vows they had once made to each other. "I don't want to live without you. I want to be there for Rachel, for this baby, and for you." Silvia felt her chest tighten as the words she had longed to hear fell from his lips. Tears began to stream down her face, each one a silent confession of her regret and hope. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing in me." Andy took her hand in his, the ring a warm, solid presence between them. He brought it to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I love you," he said, his voice gruff with the weight of his feelings. Her eyes searched his, looking for any hint of doubt or anger, but all she saw was love and determination. "And I love you," she replied, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry for what I've put us through." Rachel stirred in the back seat, her gentle snores a stark contrast to the intensity of the moment. Silvia knew that their decision to reconcile was not just for themselves, but for Rachel. Their family had been torn apart, but now, with this new life growing inside her, they had the chance to piece it back together. Months passed, Rachel's excitement for the new baby growing with each day. The air between Silvia and Andy grew heavier with anticipation and hope. They decided to hold a small ceremony, one that would signify their commitment to each other and to Rachel, and to the new life they were bringing into the world. Silvia was 6 months pregnant by the time they stood before their closest friends and family, her belly a round, proud declaration of their second chance at happiness. Rachel, dressed in a little white flower girl's dress, beamed up at them, her eyes shining with joy. The ceremony was held in their backyard, the setting sun casting warm hues over the simple yet beautiful decorations. Silvia wore a flowing dress that hugged her growing belly, a symbol of the life they were creating together. Andy, dressed in a sharp suit, couldn't keep his eyes off her, his love and admiration palpable. Rachel, her hand in Andy's, looked up at them, her chubby cheeks flushed with excitement. Their vows were short, but each word carried the weight of their tumultuous journey. They promised to cherish and support each other, to build a future that was honest and loving. As the minister pronounced them husband and wife once more, Rachel squealed with delight, breaking the solemnity with her pure, childlike excitement. Andy scooped her up in his arms, spinning her around as Silvia watched, her heart swelling with gratitude and hope. Emma, her eyes misty with happy tears, approached them after the ceremony. Silvia had confided in her about the affair when it first began, and she had been a silent witness to the destruction it had wrought. Now, seeing Silvia's radiant smile and the way Andy looked at her, she couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. She hugged Silvia tightly, whispering in her ear, "You've come so far. I'm proud of you." Silvia's gaze held a depth of regret as she pulled away. "It's all because of Rachel and Andy," she said softly. "They've taught me what it means to forgive, to love unconditionally." The warmth of the evening sun painted the scene in a soft glow, emphasizing the beauty of their second chance. Rachel, clinging to Andy's leg, watched them with wide eyes, sensing the gravity of the conversation despite not fully understanding it. Emma nodded, her eyes reflecting understanding. "I know Rachel's been through a lot, but she's a strong little girl. And Andy, he's always been a rock, hasn't he?" Silvia's smile grew sad. "Yes, but even rocks crack under pressure." She touched her swollen belly gently. "But now, with this new life, I feel like we're all healing." Emma took Rachel's hand, leading her over to a table laden with finger food and drinks. "Come on, Rachel, let's get you a plate before everything is gone." Rachel giggled and followed, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Silvia watched them, feeling a pang of guilt for the pain she had caused, for the moments she had missed, and for the future she had once almost destroyed. Her thoughts were interrupted by Andy's arm sliding around her waist, pulling her into the warmth of his embrace. "Thank you for giving us this chance," she murmured into his chest, her voice muffled by his suit jacket. He kissed the top of her head, his breath warm against her hair. "Thank you for fighting for us," he replied. Their eyes met again, and Rachel giggled, tugging at Andy's pant leg. "Kiss Mommy," she exclaimed, her voice carrying across the lawn. Andy looked down at Rachel, then back at Silvia, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Silvia felt the heat rise to her cheeks as she nodded, a silent affirmation of her love and commitment. They leaned in, their lips meeting in a tender kiss, filled with the promise of a brighter future. Rachel squealed with delight, jumping up and down. The applause from their guests washed over them, melding with the sound of Rachel's laughter and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. The kiss was a declaration of their love, a testament to the resilience of their bond, and a promise to Rachel that she was the center of their world. The warmth of Andy's embrace was a balm to Sylvia's soul. As they pulled back, Rachel looked up at them, her eyes alight with happiness. She had been the catalyst for this moment, the reason Silvia had sought redemption. Andy's hand remained on Sylvia's belly, feeling the gentle kicks of their unborn child, a silent promise that their love could conquer even the darkest of storms.